At 3:25 in the morning on June 19, 1989, a 911 dispatcher in Collingwood, Ontario picked up a call that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A woman's voice came through the line, weak and fading, barely audible over the static. The voice was strained, desperate, fighting for every breath. She managed to whisper just a few words. Words the dispatcher would replay in her mind for years before the line went completely dead. When police arrived at the basement apartment on Oak Street just minutes later, they found 33-year-old Debbie Timlock lying motionless beside the telephone. The handset still clutched desperately in her outstretched hand, her fingers locked around it, even in death. Detective Morrison stepped through the doorway and immediately froze in his tracks. He'd been a cop for over 2 decades, had seen his share of violence and tragedy, but this was different. Blood covered the apartment like someone had taken buckets of paint and thrown them with wild abandon against every surface. The walls, the floors, the furniture, everything was splattered with crimson evidence of unspeakable violence. The scene told a story of brutality so extreme that even seasoned officers who had worked homicides for years felt physically sick. This quiet lakeside community, known for its pristine ski slopes, sailing regattas, and tourist-friendly charm, was never supposed to witness this kind of evil. Things like this didn't happen in Collingwood. Just hours earlier, Debbie had been laughing with friends at a local restaurant, her voice bright and full of life, talking about plans for the upcoming week and her daughter's activities. At 33 years old, she was a beautiful single mother who had built a good life for herself and her daughter. She conquered ski slopes in winter with fearless grace and sailed the harbor in summer with equal passion and skill. She'd left her 6-year-old daughter Lacey safe at her parents' home for the night, planning to pick her up first thing in the morning. They were going to spend the day together. Maybe go to the park or the beach. Just normal mother-daughter plans. Plans that would never happen. When Debbie left the restaurant that night around 11 p.m., a massive storm was rolling through Collingwood like an angry beast. Lightning tore across the sky in brilliant white flashes. Torrential rain pounded the streets, creating rivers in the gutters and making visibility almost zero. Her friends had expressed genuine concern about the dangerous driving conditions as they parted ways in the parking lot, suggesting she wait out the worst of the storm. But Debbie was an experienced driver, comfortable in all weather. She waved goodbye through the rain, her headlights cutting twin beams through the darkness and the downpour as she drove toward home, windshield wipers working frantically against the deluge. She had no idea she was driving toward her final moments. She had no idea that someone had been watching her, waiting for her. The blood trail led investigators through Debbie's apartment like a horrifying roadmap. In the hallway, they discovered metal-framed eyeglasses covered in crimson, abandoned in what appeared to be a panicked flight. A woman's shoe lay discarded nearby, another silent witness to unspeakable terror. In the bedroom, the waterbed told its own disturbing story. Blood spattered the headboard in abstract patterns. Sheets and clothing lay scattered across the floor. But it was in the kitchen where investigators found something that would change forensic history forever. The kitchen window stood open at ground level, easily accessible from outside. Someone could step right through from the yard without much difficulty. Rain had blown in through the opening, soaking the windowsill and pooling on the floor. Scattered dishes in the sink spoke of violent, hurried entry. Plates and cups knocked askew by someone climbing through in the darkness. And there, partially hidden in the grass just outside the window, beneath some leafy growth, lay something extraordinary. A single crushed tomato that had fallen or been knocked from a nearby plant. Officer Jerry Webb crouched beside the crushed fruit, careful not to disturb it further, and made a discovery that seemed too bizarre, too convenient, too perfect to be real. Pressed into the soft, pulpy flesh of the tomato was a perfect footprint, complete with intricate tread patterns preserved like ancient fossils in stone or like a stamp in wax. Every ridge, every groove, every detail of someone's shoe sole had been captured with remarkable clarity. Think about that for a second. A tomato. A simple garden vegetable that would normally be considered completely worthless as evidence. Something you'd step over without a second thought. Had somehow captured a detailed impression of someone's shoe. Possibly the shoe belonging to the person who had just brutally ended Debbie's life on the other side of that window. The conditions had to be exactly right for this to happen. The tomato had to be fresh and firm enough to hold an impression, but ripe enough to compress. The rain from the storm had made it wet, which actually helped preserve the detail. And the weight of the person stepping on it, all 350 pounds of James Brown, had created the perfect amount of pressure to leave behind this incredible piece of evidence. They photographed it carefully, documenting every ridge and pattern from multiple angles with precise attention to detail. Then they made a crucial decision. They stored the tomato in Debbie's own refrigerator, knowing this evidence was literally rotting away with each passing hour. The medical examiner's report read like an absolute nightmare. Sexual assault. 2 devastating stab wounds, one piercing her heart, another severing her spine. But the pathologist delivered the most chilling detail with clinical precision. Based on the blood trail and the location of the spinal injury, Debbie had been paralyzed from the waist down when she crawled to that phone. Let that sink in slowly. She couldn't feel her legs. She couldn't walk. She dragged herself across the floor, leaving a trail of blood, reaching for that phone with everything she had left. She died knowing help was coming, but understanding it would arrive too late. Investigators first explored Debbie's past, looking for anyone who might want to harm her. They uncovered her relationship with Ron Osborne, a drug smuggler she had testified against 4 years earlier. Could this be revenge from the criminal underworld? The theory crumbled quickly when they discovered Osborne was locked up in prison. His associates were cleared of involvement after thorough investigation. Debbie had been small time in their world, not worth the risk of ending her life. They interviewed her ex-husband next, finding only an amicable divorce, solid alibis, and absolutely no motive for violence. Another dead end in a case growing colder by the hour. The small-town police department was running out of leads, and then they discovered something interesting. Debbie's former next-door neighbor had recently returned to Collingwood. His name was James Brown. At 23 years old, James Brown had once been an Olympic wrestling hopeful. Dreams of athletic glory had taken him to Japan to train and compete. But something had gone catastrophically wrong overseas. The details were murky, but Brown had returned to Collingwood carrying a criminal record like a festering wound. Assaults, thefts, break-ins, painting a portrait of a man completely transformed from the athlete who had left. Friends revealed that Brown had made unwelcome advances toward Debbie when they lived in adjacent apartments. His imposing presence, 6'3" and 350 pounds, had been intimidating. Debbie had complained to friends about feeling uncomfortable around him. When questioned about the night of the crime, Brown's story sounded like desperate fiction. He claimed that mysterious assailants had attacked him at a hotel, beaten him unconscious, and left him on a roadside miles away from Collingwood. He'd woken up disoriented and confused, he said, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Detectives exchanged skeptical glances. Who could assault a man this massive, a trained wrestler, and leave him unconscious on the side of the road? Then one of the investigators noticed something crucial while reviewing Brown's old mugshots from his previous arrests. In every photo, he was wearing glasses, metal-framed glasses. When investigators brought Brown in for another interview, the glasses had mysteriously vanished. He insisted he'd lost them recently. but his nervous demeanor told a different story. The police saw an opportunity to set an elaborate trap. They meticulously cleaned Debbie's blood from the glasses found at the crime scene, removing all visible traces of the violence they had witnessed. The plan was simple but clever. They wanted to see if Brown would identify them as his own without knowing they'd been found at a scene where his life had ended. An officer posed as a helpful citizen who had supposedly found the glasses, approaching Brown with the cleaned evidence. Brown examined them carefully, turning them over in his massive hands. His face showed visible suspicion. After a long pause, he stated firmly that these were not his glasses. But investigators weren't convinced. Something about his certainty felt rehearsed, practiced, desperate. They obtained a warrant to search Brown's vehicle. Inside, they found treasure beyond their hopes. Blue canvas, running shoes manufactured in Czechoslovakia. The shoes were distinctive. They had been issued specifically to provincial inmates during Brown's previous incarceration. The herringbone tread pattern looked remarkably similar to the impression preserved in the tomato's flesh. Now they had potential evidence connecting Brown to the scene. But they needed proof that would hold up in court. And that's when forensic investigator Jerry Webb came up with an experiment that sounded like something from a science fiction movie. Webb faced a challenge no textbook had ever prepared him for. How do you prove a shoe impression on a tomato in court? How do you demonstrate to a jury that this bizarre piece of evidence is legitimate? He designed an experiment that was as creative as it was scientific. Webb recruited a volunteer and had him don a bomb suit, one of those massive protective suits that bomb disposal experts wear. Then they added weights to the suit until it matched Brown's exact body weight, 350 pounds. Webb sprayed fresh tomatoes with water to simulate the storm conditions from that night. The rain that had been pouring down would have made the tomatoes wet, potentially affecting how they compressed. Then, wearing Brown's confiscated shoes, the weighted volunteer stepped on tomato after tomato. The results were stunning. The experimental impression matched the crime scene photograph with frightening accuracy. The herringbone pattern, the depth of the impression, the way the tomato flesh compressed. Everything lined up perfectly. But Webb knew this alone wasn't enough. Thousands of provincial inmates across Canada had worn identical shoes. The shoe print could match, but that didn't necessarily mean it was Brown's shoe that had crushed that specific tomato on that specific night. They needed something more. Something that would definitively connect those blood-stained glasses to James Brown. Enter Dr. Graham Strong, a forensic expert with a specialty in optical analysis. He was handed what seemed like an impossible task: prove that the blood-stained glasses found at the crime scene belonged to James Brown, using only old mugshots for comparison. The challenge seemed insurmountable. The mugshots had been taken years earlier under different lighting conditions. The angles were all wrong. The photos were grainy and low quality. How could anyone make a definitive comparison? Then Dr. Strong noticed something extraordinary while examining the mugshots under magnification. In Brown's eyes, barely visible, were two tiny white dots, reflections from the police photographer's flash. These microscopic pinpoints of light had been captured in Brown's corneas when the mugshot was taken. Think about how incredible that is. When a camera flash goes off, it reflects in your eyes. That's why people get red-eye in photographs. But Dr. Strong realized these reflections could tell him something crucial about the glasses Brown was wearing. Using Brown's medical records, Strong obtained his interpupillary distance, the measurement between the centers of his pupils, which was 72 millimeters. This measurement is unique to each person and doesn't change significantly over time. Strong began painstaking calculations: frame width, lens size, temple length, the curvature of the lenses, the positioning of the nose pads. Every measurable aspect of the glasses found at the crime scene was compared to every measurable aspect of the glasses in Brown's mugshots. He made 23 separate points of comparison, 23 individual measurements that all had to align. The odds against coincidence were astronomical. These glasses belonged to James Brown. But then investigators noticed something strange. In the mugshots, Brown's glasses appeared to be gold-colored. The glasses found at the crime scene were brown. How could they be the same glasses? The answer was almost poetic in its irony. When investigators had cleaned Debbie's blood from the glasses to set their trap for Brown, they'd inadvertently rubbed away part of the gold laminate coating. The evidence had literally transformed as they tried to preserve it. In January 1992, James Brown's trial began in a courthouse filled with spectators drawn by the bizarre nature of the evidence. A crushed tomato and mathematical calculations based on flash reflections in old photographs. It sounded too strange to be real. The defense attorney attacked the prosecution's case with theatrical skepticism. He argued that convicting a man based on vegetables and shadows represented fantasy rather than justice. He pointed out that thousands of inmates had worn identical shoes. He questioned whether a tomato could reliably preserve a shoe impression. He suggested the entire case was built on coincidence and scientific overreach. But then Dr. Graham Strong took the witness stand. With quiet confidence, he explained the mathematical precision of his measurements. He walked the jury through each of the 23 points of comparison. He demonstrated why the odds of such perfect alignment were essentially impossible unless the glasses truly belonged to Brown. Forensic investigator Jerry Webb followed, demonstrating his tomato experiments with scientific rigor. The courtroom watched as he showed photograph after photograph of experimental impressions matching the crime scene evidence. The science was undeniable. The prosecution wove their narrative with devastating precision. Brown had climbed through the open kitchen window that stormy night, his foot crushing the tomato as he entered. He'd found Debbie asleep and attacked her with savage brutality. During the assault, he had lost his glasses, either knocked off in the struggle or dropped in his panicked flight from the scene. Debbie, paralyzed and dying, had crawled over those glasses to reach the phone. Her blood on the lenses became her final testimony, her last words when her voice could no longer speak. The prosecutor's closing argument resonated through the silent courtroom. Debbie Timlock could not identify her attacker before death claimed her. But she didn't need to. The evidence spoke for her, a crushed tomato and two tiny reflections that became her voice from the grave. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree ending life. Life sentence without possibility of parole for 25 years. James Brown walked out of prison on October 16, 2018, after serving nearly 27 years. The Parole Board of Canada granted him full parole, believing he had been rehabilitated and posed minimal risk to society. He had already been on day parole since July 2015, and by 2018 had expanded privileges, allowing him to spend 5 nights per week in the community. According to parole documents, Brown had become a member of a community club and was volunteering at local events. The parole board noted that he had shown consistent positive behavior during his gradual reintegration into society. He was 52 years old, no longer the massive wrestler who had terrorized Debbie Timlock, but seemingly a changed man. But appearances can be deceiving. In July 2023, the parole board lifted one of Brown's conditions, allowing him to enter bars and drinking establishments, though he was still prohibited from consuming alcohol or drugs. The board stated there had been no concerns with your behavior since his release. That assessment would prove to be tragically premature. On February 13, 2024, just 5.5 years after his release, the Parole Board of Canada made the rare decision to revoke James Brown's parole. Parole revocation happens in only about 10% of cases, and this decision sent shockwaves through the Collingwood community. The reasons were disturbing. Brown, now 58 years old, had been involved in multiple incidents of violence. He'd gotten into a physical fight with 3 men. He'd been involved in a road rage incident that escalated to physical confrontation. Most troubling of all, he'd pushed a young woman in her early 20s, someone he referred to as his adopted daughter, up against a wall. The parole board's report was scathing. They noted Brown's relationship with the young woman displayed a lack of healthy boundaries and showed a high degree of fixation. These words should sound familiar. The same fixation that had led to Debbie Timlock's brutal ending 35 years earlier. Although you demonstrated consistent positive behavior for many years on conditional release in the community, the parole board wrote, you were involved in numerous problematic incidents leading up to the suspension and revocation of your full parole. The board concluded that Brown's behavior demonstrated a return to poor managed emotions, deficits in problem solving, and a pattern of violence that indicated he remained a danger to the public. In March 2025, Brown appeared before the parole board via video hearing, applying for both day parole and full parole. The board denied both requests. The man who had served 27 years, who had been deemed rehabilitated, who had been trusted to reintegrate into society, was back behind bars. While there has been progress in your correctional plan since your original incarceration, the March 2025 Parole Board report stated, there are deficits in personal emotional orientation and attitude, and these have been illustrated in your behavior. As of today in late 2025, James Brown remains in custody, serving his life sentence for the first-degree ending of Debbie Timlock's life. The parole board has determined the risk of reoffending is too great. The anger management issues that fueled his original crime have resurfaced. The fixation on women that led to Debbie's final terrifying moments has manifested again. The community of Collingwood breathed a collective sigh of relief when his parole was revoked. Many had been outraged when he was released in 2018, feeling that no amount of time could atone for what he'd done to Debbie. The fact that he violated his parole conditions through violence confirmed their worst fears. James Brown had not truly changed. Debbie's daughter Lacey, who was just 6 years old when her mother was taken from her, is now 41 years old. She has lived most of her life without her mother. The little girl who was safely sleeping at her grandparents' house that stormy night grew up knowing her mother had been stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. The judge who sentenced Brown in 1992 called his crime an ending of rage and sexual degradation, fueled by alcohol and unrequited obsession. Those words proved prophetic. Even after nearly 3 decades in prison, Brown's rage and fixation remained just beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. The Debbie Timlock case represents one of the most unusual pieces of forensic evidence in criminal history. A crushed tomato, a vegetable that would normally be thrown away or stepped over, became the key to solving a brutal crime. Think about the incredible chain of coincidences that had to occur for this evidence to exist. The storm that night had knocked tomatoes from a plant growing near Debbie's window. Brown climbed through that window, stepping on one of the fallen tomatoes in the dark and rain. The wet conditions and the soft flesh of the tomato combined to create a perfect impression of his shoe tread. And investigators recognized its value before it rotted away completely. Officer Jerry Webb later reflected that in 28 years of policing, he never encountered another impression in produce. It was a once-in-a-career piece of evidence. But the tomato alone wasn't enough. It was the combination of evidence that sealed Brown's fate. The unusual shoes issued to provincial inmates, the mathematical analysis of the glasses, the blood trail that told the story of Debbie's final desperate moments. Each piece by itself might have been explained away. Together, they formed an unbreakable chain of proof. Dr. Graham Strong's analysis of the glasses represented a breakthrough in forensic science. Using reflections in corneas to establish the dimensions and characteristics of eyeglasses had never been done before. His 23-point comparison set a new standard for optical forensic analysis. But beyond the science and the unusual evidence, this case reveals something darker about human nature. James Brown's obsession with Debbie Timlock didn't emerge the night he ended her life. He'd made unwelcome advances when they were neighbors. He'd made her uncomfortable enough that she complained to friends. When she rejected him, his fixation apparently grew into rage. The fact that he developed a similar fixation on a young woman decades later, after 27 years in prison, suggests that whatever drove him to attack Debbie was never truly addressed or resolved. Prison didn't change him. Therapy didn't change him. Time didn't change him. Debbie had been out with friends, enjoying her life, being a good mother to her daughter. She drove home in a storm, probably thinking about picking up Lacey the next morning, maybe planning what they'd do together. She had no idea that her former neighbor had been drinking at a local bar, consuming alcohol and drugs, working up the courage to act on his obsession. When she got home and went to bed, she probably felt safe. The storm was raging outside, but she was in her own home, doors locked. She didn't know that Brown had been watching, waiting, planning. She didn't know he would climb through her kitchen window and destroy her life in a frenzy of violence. The most haunting part of this case is imagining Debbie's final moments. Paralyzed from the waist down, bleeding from multiple stab wounds, she dragged herself across the floor. She crawled over Brown's glasses, leaving her blood on them. She reached the phone and managed to make that call. She whispered those few words to the dispatcher before she couldn't speak anymore. She fought to live. She fought to identify her attacker. She fought to leave evidence behind. And in a way, she succeeded. Her blood on those glasses, analyzed through breakthrough forensic techniques, helped convict her attacker. The tomato he stepped on climbing through her window preserved his footprint. She may not have been able to tell police who had attacked her, but the evidence she left behind spoke for her. The storm that raged through Collingwood that June night in 1989 has long since passed into memory. But the evidence it helped create, a footprint preserved in produce, reflections captured in corneas, blood on eyeglasses, proved that justice sometimes comes in the most unexpected forms. In a small town where such violence seemed impossible, science gave Debbie Timlock the voice death had stolen. Her attacker thought he had escaped into the storm, but he left himself behind in a crushed tomato and blood-stained glasses. Sometimes justice requires brilliant forensic work. Sometimes it requires mathematical precision. Sometimes it requires innovative experiments with bomb suits and fresh tomatoes. But most importantly, it requires investigators who refuse to give up, who see evidence where others see garbage, who listen to what the dead are trying to tell them. Officer Webb kept that tomato refrigerated, knowing it was rotting evidence that needed to be preserved. Dr. Strong spent countless hours analyzing microscopic reflections in old photographs. Detective Morrison pieced together a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. They all refused to let Debbie's voice be silenced. The case became famous, featured on forensic files, and studied in forensic science courses around the world. The tomato became legendary in forensic circles, a reminder that evidence can come from anywhere, that investigators must keep an open mind, that science can speak for the dead. But for Debbie's family, it was never about fame or forensic breakthroughs. It was about justice for a woman who deserved so much better than the brutal ending she received. It was about making sure her daughter knew that her mother's attacker had been caught and convicted. It was about ensuring that Debbie's final act, crawling to that phone, leaving her blood on crucial evidence, had not been in vain. James Brown sits in prison today, his parole revoked, his freedom lost again. The man who thought he could climb through a window on a stormy night, end an innocent woman's life, and disappear into the darkness learned that evidence doesn't forget. Blood doesn't lie. And sometimes, vegetables speak louder than words. The dead, it turns out, do speak, if you know how to listen. And on that stormy night in June 1989, a crushed tomato and a pair of blood-stained glasses made sure Debbie Timlock's voice was heard. Justice was served, but it came too late to save a 33-year-old woman who just wanted to drive home safely from dinner with friends. Too late to save a 6-year-old girl from losing her mother. Too late to prevent a brutal crime that never should have happened. The lesson is clear. Evidence matters. Science matters. And sometimes, the most unlikely objects become the most important witnesses of all.